I'm excited to talk to every one of you because I believe you have an electric car in your future. It is a wonderful time to be alive. I mean, given that we've had a wonderful growth in electric vehicles, pretty soon we believe it's going to be the viable alternative to internal combustion engines. We think a decade from now, you're going to look back and say, wow, I love having my electric vehicle. It is so much less expensive, so much more convenient, so much better for the environment, and it just simply works. And what we think is going to happen is it's going to fundamentally change the transportation and the electric power business. And I'm going to talk about the electric power car, and Michael's going to talk about how it works. Now, one of the things I've written about in about a dozen of my books, starting with 1 Minute Millionaire, is a law called Occams Razor. And if you have two equally likely solutions to a problem, it's always best to choose the simplest, the straightforward one. And I think you're going to see the straightforward idea that we're talking about today. If you do a comparative analysis of internal combustion engines, they literally have hundreds of moving parts, most of which those of us that aren't into the oily secrets too much hear about at the worst and most inconvenient time. You're in a hurry to get to work, and all of a sudden all the red lights come on, and it said your heating system's out, your cooling system's out, your exhaust system's gone, you know, the spark plugs aren't working, and you're also out of gas. And what we're saying is there's a lot of stuff in a car right now, an internal combustion engine, that can break down. And the big news here is that the #1 contributor to air pollution, unequivocally, is motor vehicles. Now, 1/3 of all pollution, it said, comes from automobiles, trucks, trains, and any of the transportation vehicles, and we'll include ships in that. 1/3 comes from buildings, whether it's commercial or residential, and the other 1/3 comes from our utility companies, all of which Michael will talk to at the very end of this. Now, the next comparative analysis you may be looking at is the electric motor itself, and some of you that are into the sciences know Faraday's law, but let's compare the 100 moving parts to the electric vehicle, which has one moving part, virtually no maintenance, extremely high torque. If you've been in one, the takeoff is amazing. If you go online on Google and you look at, there are 12 major vehicles, but we think every one of the major motor cars companies in the world will be making electric vehicles in the next few years, and it's going to be ubiquitous as far as we're concerned. Anyhow, if you've sat in one or you watch it on Google, when they take off, that compared to any of the hot rods, electric vehicles, and the Tesla in particular, just beat all of them. It's high efficiency, lower operating costs, regeneration, so that you're going to have longer lasting brakes. But most of all, one of the biggest things all of us want is convenience. That's why in the morning you have Keurig coffee where you just make it and you just press the button and whoosh, it comes out. Because most people, especially women, and I have 4 daughters and a son, so I can tell you that if you've got your daughter out and she runs out of gas and she's got to get gas late at night, sometimes that's a little bit of an unsavory experience. If they have to go and wait for an oil change, that may not be their highest and best use or something they want to do. If you've been pouring fuel, and there's none of us that haven't poured fuel and had the hose nozzle drip on our shoes or splash on our clothes or negatively perfume our hands such that you got to run in and wash it and get it clean. And that probably happens when you're going to the most important meeting of your life because you're nervous, you're late, you forgot to get fuel the night before. Well, we're saying electronic convenience is you're just going to plug in and roll away, and that's going to keep getting better and better. But let's talk about the fundamentals of this. All of us know how to think in horsepower. We've all seen a horse. We've ridden, most of us have probably ridden a horse. We're in Dallas right now, and there are a lot of horses here, and my daughters have owned horses, so we've got some familiarity. And cars have a certain amount of horsepower, but if you take 100 horsepower, what does that equal? Well, that equals 74 kilowatts. So now you have sort of a frame of reference and a perception. And 1 gallon of gasoline equals 36 kilowatt hours, right? And the average American home uses about 30 kilowatt hours a day, or 1 gallon of gas to run your home, basically. And so if you do the comparative analysis, Let's say the average home in America uses 940 kilowatt hours per month. 1 gallon runs a home for about a day, we said. 1 gallon takes an average of a car of about 25 miles. Conclusion, gasoline is extremely efficient. However, cars consume vast amounts of energy and emit total pollution, and people like Richard Branson have started the Carbon War Room to say, hey, look, we all live in this one little biosphere, this one little atmosphere, this one little ocean of air surrounding us. We've got to watch how much carbon dioxide we pour in there. So vehicle fundamentals, gasoline equals about 250 kilowatt hours or 100 miles. The Leaf automobile is about 24 kilowatt hour battery or about 100 miles. Tesla S has an 85 kilowatt battery and will go also about 100 miles. And you got to start thinking about, are we going to get that better? And the answer is yes, and we're going to talk about that. Returning one more time to Occams Razor. If you have two equally likely solutions to a problem, choose the simplest one, is what Occam said. But the EV, the electronic vehicle, has not replaced the internal combustion engines because of fuel. So you say, well, wait a second, the comparative analysis, what's the Achilles heel for electronic vehicles? Well, it takes, right now, 2 to 8 hours recharge time. We're saying that's going to be quicker. And we're saying the three big challenges, just so you got it, are cost. They're exceedingly expensive currently. Number two, energy density. Number three, recharging time, all of which there are a lot of people working on, because a lot of people are starting to look in the same direction that Michael and I are looking in, and our whole team's looking in. But let's say the Tesla S has a range of about 280 miles, right? The cost of a battery replacement is somewhere between $20,000 and $40,000. And because we haven't got enough time under our belt on this, we don't know exactly the longevity, the lifetime of a battery yet. And energy is everywhere, but there's very few recharging stations. And even though, like, I know the Tesla best of the electronic cars currently, and I have one on order, but they've got two trunks basically, and you don't want to be carrying around a heavy-duty electric cable with you everywhere you go. So the battery technology, the current revolution, again, the challenges are cost, number two, energy density, number three, recharge time. So the historic metrics of the battery technology is that energy density goes up about 15% every 18 months, and the cost of a kilowatt goes down about 15% every 18 months. And that's putting us in a perfect place, because what we call it is a strategic inflection point. And the guy who created this 50 years ago that has changed the world is Dr. Gorton Moore. And Moore's law says everything in silicon doubles in effectiveness every 18 months, and it halves in price. That's why cell phones have gone from giant size to mini size. The internet was created because of that. And we're saying that the whole analogy, which Michael originated, was from Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs, when he invented everything, but he created the iPhone, which we're going to call generically the smartphone, was only 2007. It's only 2015 now, so it's only been out for 8 years. He said, look, at the best, I'll get 5% of the market share. Well, right now, 100% of the people in the world almost have, even in the poorest countries I go to, Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or India, or I'm in China a couple times a year, everybody's got a cell phone. In China, a lot of the kids have 2 cell phones, which is sort of amazing to me. What Michael and I say, though, in the article we've got written, which we'd gladly have you read if you'd like to, is that we're saying, look, there's 7 billion cell phones in the world. There's more cell phones right now than there are toilets. With that, I'd like to have this transition to you, Michael.
All right, thanks, Mark. So let me start with something that Mark said about midway through the speech, and that is cars use a tremendous amount of energy. And to reiterate what Mark said, a car, you can fill up the gas tank and drive it for 5 hours. If you take that same tank of gas and connect it to a generator on a home, you can run the home for a week. It's a lot of energy we're consuming in cars, and I think it's very compelling. Every time you talk to a Tesla owner, you feel like they work for the company. They want to sell you the car. And
every driver feels that way.
So what we're going to see as we move forward is electricity consumption as a function of electric cars is going to increase. And we've got to ask ourselves, how much is it going to increase, and where is the electricity going to come from? So the average driver right now does 14,000 miles a year. And if you use the Tesla metrics, and I think the metrics are going to get better as we go, but if you use the Tesla metric, we're looking at an increase of about 4,300 kilowatt hours per year. If there's 1 billion cars in the world, and we know there's a lot more than that, but just for the sake of assumption, let's assume there are 1 billion and that 25% move to electric cars. We're going to add that huge number of megawatt hours per year, and which is roughly 1/20th of the total electricity used worldwide. So once again, if we assume only 1 billion cars and only 25% of those, 250 million, become electric vehicles, then 1/20th of our total consumption right now is going to be an electric consumption. So where does our power come from today? Here's a little background: nuclear, coal, and natural gas. When we look at this industry right now, we don't see a whole lot of nuclear power plants being built around the world today. We see no new coal plants being built. Fortunately, at least in the United States, natural gas is plentiful and cheap and relatively clean. So we see a lot of natural gas, but we have a number of power plants that are going to be closing down over the next 10 to 20 years because they're old. And what are we going to replace them with? Well, if you look at this slide, it's natural gas. This is what the industry looks like right now, and it sort of reiterates what I just said. The natural gas industry has actually been growing quite a bit over the last 10 years. Coal, I think, we'll see shrinking. Nuclear, we will see shrinking. And so, you know, remembering what I said a little while ago, 1 billion cars, 25% of which would put a tremendous workload on our electric power grid. So where does all the additional power coming from? Question number one, are we talking about solar-powered cars? Could we put solar panels on the roof of our car and run it? Well, we did the math on this, and it looks like this. The average solar panel it's about 3 feet wide by 6 feet wide, or 6 feet long, and it produces 300 watts. So if you don't know what a watt is, just think of the old light bulbs that were 100-watt light bulbs to kind of give you a reference. But with the old Tesla Roadster, it would take 73 panels to power that Tesla. So it looks like this. We're driving down the road and we've got a huge sail above us. Our conclusion here is solar isn't efficient enough to drive the minute-by-minute electricity usage for a car. But we could have filling stations that have huge fields of solar behind them. In fact, my company right now is, I was just standing in a cornfield in North Carolina on Friday, and that cornfield was almost a mile square, and at this time next year, it's going to be a mile square of solar panels. Could power 22,000 homes and charge a number of cars. So if we think about recharging 20 cars per hour, which is about what a gas station, a reasonable gas station does. You fill up about 20 cars per hour. That's 200 cars per day, and that would require a field of 40 acres. Well, for the people that are on the call that are not farmers, 40 acres is quite a bit of land. We're not going to have gas stations with 40 acres behind them. Maybe out in the country, but I think our conclusion here is it could work, but only for those power charging stations that are out in the country between cities. But there is another solution, and this solution is growing incredibly fast right now, and that is grid solar. In other words, large fields like the one we're building in North Carolina with hundreds of megawatts. In other words, solar panels that cover big enough fields so the output competes with those nuclear and coal and natural gas. And I think most people know this. I still see a couple of surprised folks when I say this nowadays, but solar is now cheaper than nuclear. And it's just about the same. It's just a little bit more than natural gas. And so as Mark Victor Hansen said a little while ago, Gordon Moore's law for semiconductors more or less applies to solar. And every year, solar is getting cheaper and more efficient. And we're just a year away from solar being able to compete with natural gas. Not replace natural gas, because the sun does set, but extend the lifetime of natural gas and support natural gas as a primary generating resource. And, you know, I think the best thing in the world that we've said so far is that it can do it with a price that is parity with natural gas, so that we're not having to bring something in that ends up costing us more. So, you know, I think grid solar, the big question everybody's asking is, does it add up from a cost perspective, and will it be able to support the advent of the electric vehicle? So when we look at general trend lines, this is what electricity cost has looked like for the past 30 years, and this is what the cost of solar has looked like for the last 30 years. So one is up, the other one is down. And over the last few months, you can see the spot price for solar has gone at a nice downward trend. And in this case, when we're talking about cost, downward is good. So, you know, if we want to understand what I was saying a little while ago about how solar competes with nuclear, coal, and natural gas, this is a very interesting slide, because the three blue bars are from an MIT study in 2009. Now, 2009 was some years ago, but nobody's redone this study yet, to our knowledge. But basically what they said was, if we build a brand new nuclear power plant, what will the output electricity be able to sell for on a wholesale basis? So that's what those blue bars are. First one is nuclear, the next one is coal, the last one is natural gas. And in 2009, when I entered the solar industry, that first green bar is what solar looked like. And you had to be insane to assume that solar would be able to compete. But the reality is, by the time you got to 12, it was getting close, and last year, it was at parity in most places to nuclear or to coal and natural gas. And within a few years, it's going to be cheaper. But again, it won't replace it because the sun sets. So, you know, I think the bottom line, going back to Mark's comment about electric vehicles will consume a lot of electricity. Where is the new electricity going to come from? Once again, the electric vehicle is unbelievably efficient compared to the internal combustion engine. We know a guy who's got an old beat-up 1970s model car with rust in it, and he's replaced the gas engine with an electric motor. And he has a good time going to all of the Formula One racetracks and challenging the Formula One vehicles on the first mile, and he wins. Why? Because that one moving part electric motor can produce instantaneous torque, whereas the chemical engines have to build up. And so, you know, the people who have owned electric vehicles are the biggest advocate salespeople out there. The batteries, again, are the Achilles heel, and you probably know Elon Musk and many others around the world are working on improving that. There are so many new battery technologies right now. I think that the battery problem will be solved, and it'll be solved a lot faster than what we expected. And to reiterate another thing that Mark Victor Hansen said a few minutes ago, the cell phone, when Apple first introduced the iPhone, nobody predicted how quickly everybody would have a smartphone. And you can't go into a room nowadays and ask who owns a cell phone or a smartphone because everybody raises their hand. You have to ask who doesn't own one. That kind of trend line is what we're going to see because of Occams Razor. The simplest solution will win, and particularly when it is also the cheapest solution. So EVs are going to add a huge load to our grid, and we're going to be looking everywhere for ways to find more electricity to supply those electric vehicles. And I think solar PV is one of the great solutions. And that is it. I am done.
We are open to questions, and Rick will handle that. I'll just add one other thing to what my dear friend Michael said, and that is we love quotes, both of us and both of us. And some, I don't remember whether it was said, but Michael has been in the nuclear power industry and is also a great scientist and has seen both sides of this, and we both see a huge that very few people are thinking about. And so my favorite quote is from Winston Churchill, who said, Americans always do the right thing, but only after they've exhausted every other possibility. And we think that let's have our eyes open, let's take off the blinders, let's look forward. And I said in the beginning of my talk and the end, we think you've got an electric vehicle in your future because it's got one moving part. The expenses are going to come skyrocketing down. Gordon Moore's law, which he wrote a whole book called Strategic Inflection Point, which says one day there's no chips needed, next day we need 10 million chips going computers. I don't know if you read that book, I did. And what happens is we're saying the same thing that happened with Steve Jobs and the smartphone is going to happen with electric cars. We are 100% for it. We're hoping you're for it, but we want to make sure there's electricity because there's four parts to the industry. The creation energy, which we're saying, we're not saying let's get rid of any other thing. We're saying we're going to have an enormous, what Michael said is modest, a 20% increase for cars. Then there's the storage of energy, which we said the breakthroughs are enormous. Then there's the transmission of energy, which is getting better, but there's nobody working on it like they are working on batteries, in my opinion. And then last is utilization. We're saying, look, the utilization is going to skyrocket. It's going to hockey puck up. We want to be in advance of it. We want you to think with us. We want to create these great solar farms and solar pieces of land like you talked about here in Texas and in Charlotte and different places in the world that we're working. With that, we're open to questions.
Rick?
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And again, if you have any questions for either of our presenters, please chat those in the lower right corner. You can send your chat message to all panelists if you do not want to share the question with the audience, or you can chat to all participants if you want the entire audience to know that it was you asking that question. And there was one logistics-related question from Michael. Will the presentation PDF be emailed at the end of the webinar? All registrants will receive an email tomorrow with a link both to a recording of the audio and video of today's webinar, along with a PDF of the slides. Okay, first question we had is from Alhenia is, does the 2014 cost of around 6.1 cents per kilowatt hour that's shown on the graph for solar, does that include subsidies or is it without subsidies? And if solar is so close to grid parity, why aren't we seeing a much greater explosion of solar installations? Does it just take a time for the market to catch on to this trend?
I'll let you go first.
Right, okay. So I live in Texas, and most people know Texas considers itself to be an energy state. And we are. You know, you go almost anywhere in the world, and it's Saudi Arabia and Texas. We understand energy really well here. And we spell it with a three-letter word. Actually, two three-letter words, O-I-L and G-A-S. So, you know, with regards to subsidies, my fellow energy Texans are always saying, well, solar only is able to compete because of the subsidies. And I sat down with somebody who is one of the preeminent oil and gas family members in the world, and we talked about what were the subsidies in solar, and then we compared them to the subsidies for the petroleum products. And at the end of the day, I was saying, wow, I'll take an even playing field because solar does have subsidies. There's an investment tax credit that is unique. And then, like any large construction project, you have accelerated depreciation, which you can write off against your income taxes. But that's pretty much it. The investment tax credit is 30%. Any power plant that's built has accelerated depreciation, so that part is equal. But if you look at oil and gas from exploration through production and delivery and refinement and delivered into the power industry, they actually have significantly more than that 30%. So yes, solar does have subsidies. It's smaller than any other type of energy right now.
Okay, I would like to, this is Mark adding my 2 cents, so to speak. I got a couple little answers to you, and I hope the first one in the most macro sense, when I was in graduate school working on my doctorate, I was with one of the most esteemed men ever lived, Dr. Buckminster Fuller, arguably Einstein's best student, and we did world trends, needs, and analysis, and we said, look, the only thing that will cause population stabilization is if we triple the kilowatts per person worldwide. And the only way Bucky and I, and he was affectionately called Bucky, so I'm not demeaning my great teacher, but he said, look, the only way to do it is income energy. Today we call it alternative energy, but solar, wind, geothermal, tidal, deep ocean currents. And I'm deep in the business with a couple of different companies. And on a commercial level, I'm an advisor, and I love being with Michael and Principal Solar. On a residential level, I'm with the biggest company doing the biggest projects called Perma City Solar, and they just did 3/4 of a mile-long building called Forever 21. We're doing a $1.8 million building. The mayor of LA has asked us to have 60% solar. The mayors, I'm meeting with them next week in San Diego. They want 100% solar. So the shift has happened. In answer to your question, you asked the timeline. It's all happened in the last 2 years. And all this stuff, the reason we use the example of one of my heroes, Steve Jobs, is because he didn't see it coming. I bless Elon Musk. I think he's an absolute genius. I think most of us would agree with that. He's pushing the edge of the envelope. He's got people to wake up, throw off the blinders, and say, let's do it. As for subsidies, on home and commercial, they vaporize that 30% that Michael spoke of on the 31st day of 2016. Now, you say, well, what is that going to do to it? I'm going to say my opinion. Now, this isn't, I'm not a politico, so I can't tell you what the politicians are going to do, but I can tell you I'm part of a company in Hawaii that has got the new solution that's going to be a plug and play at a home level, not the level that Michael's talking about, which is utility, which is what we've got to have all of the above on this as far as I'm concerned. With that, Rick, I think I can hand it back. So anyhow, back to Bucky Fuller. He said we ought to have a macro grid around the world, so when you turn on energy in New York at 6 a.m. and then you ground volt it an hour later, turn it on in Ohio an hour later, and then an hour later in the Rocky Mountains, an hour later on the West Coast, just ship it from place to place. Well, that's now what's happening on the grid. We're going to be able to do that in the houses. We've got Microsoft working with one of my companies to just shift it from the house to the grid. What we need to do is have a massive creation of energy, just like Michael has suggested, and I think even if we had a 20% increase, it's not going to be enough. I'm not disagreeing with Michael. I think we're both looking in the same direction. He was just doing numbers, not the dwarf, because when you start understanding the energy needs in America, in the world, are $6 trillion a year. In the next 3 years, are projected to go to $10 trillion. This is an enormous energy need, and nobody's looking at it with full open eyes. You'd agree with me, would you, Michael?
I would.
Okay, good.
and just some numbers to emphasize that point about why aren't we seeing a greater market explosion. We actually are. We were on the phone with a major manufacturer of solar panels, And 3 years ago, they delivered 100 megawatts of modules to the United States. This year, they're delivering 1,000 megawatts, 10 times more, or gigawatt, and they're already building factories to project 1.5 gigawatts delivery next year, 1,500 megawatts. And that's just one manufacturer. There's dozens of those. So it's the market, the industry has caught on, but the general population, I don't think, has yet become aware of just how large this trend has become.
Well, Michael,
okay,
go ahead, Mark. To what you're saying, and that is, in Africa, I've invited Michael to look at the fact that we got one country that wants 2 gigawatts, just one little country called Ghana. In Indonesia, they want that. In India, they want way more than that. In China, where I work a lot, they want way more than that. I mean, there's, for the first time in history, and it may just be my naivete, but I'm pretty well traveled, 250,000 miles a year for the last 42 years. I got to tell you, I've never seen anything like this where people are saying, we don't want a little energy, we need a whole lot of energy for all of our people. Back to you, Rick.
All right, great. The next question, and this is a classic question with the Texas audience, are electric vehicles practical in pickup trucks and tractor trailers?
Well, there's a lot more space for batteries, and I would say the consideration today is, can you live with a vehicle that does 280 miles before it needs to be charged? And if the answer to that is yes, then your answer is yes. But remember, one of the Achilles heels with the electric vehicle today, and this is changing very, very quickly, is the cost. And the thing that Elon Musk and the Tesla company has done better than anybody else is they've recognized people are willing to pay $80,000 for a BMW. So what Musk did that was so brilliant was he said, I can make a car that, technologically speaking, matches the best BMW or Mercedes on the road and charge $80,000 for it, but it won't burn gas. It'll just burn electrons. And that's why he can't build cars fast enough for his orders. And that's why Mark Victor Hansen has been waiting how long for your electric car?
Yeah, when I ordered it, it was 18 months. Because I wanted exactly what you asked for. I've ordered the SUV, which is very expensive. But I want to add another answer that's a little different. It's something that most of you have probably not heard about. I'm partners with a guy who's building the world's longest public-private transportation district from Phoenix, Arizona, straight through to Las Vegas. It's all been approved. They're going to have electric charging stations every 50 miles. The guy's name is Mike Ingram. He owns Eldorado Holding Company. He just built 45,000 homes in Phoenix. And Mike sees exactly, and they've asked me to talk to Michael before the day's over about doing, solar farms right on the side of it, because obviously between Nevada and Arizona, we're going to have a lot of solar places, for 40, 80, 150 acres, and he's used to that kind of stuff and has all that accepted by both major political parties. How should I do that? Yeah. Back to you, Rick.
Okay, great. The next question is back to technology. What about fuel cell or hydrogen-powered vehicles? I've heard that although electric vehicles are lower cost now than fuel cell, mass production has already pushed down the cost of electric vehicles substantially, and that unless there's a technological breakthrough, it will be hard for them to become cost competitive with internal combustion engines anytime in the near future. But however, the fuel cell vehicles have much more room for cost reduction after they've started to scale up. And I have been seeing the Toyota Mirai has been the pace car for several NASCAR races this year. So if you could give us a comparison of hydrogen-powered versus EV.
Well, this is Michael Gorton. I'm a big fan of fuel cells. We've been using them in outer space for a long time. It's a great piece of technology. It's great chemistry and physics. So, there are some challenges. The pressures involved are pretty significant, but I think there's a great future for fuel cells. But I I think also, as much as Elon Musk and Tesla have done, I'm surprised they didn't go down that pathway, and I'd love to hear why they didn't. Why did they take the lithium-ion battery path rather than the fuel cell path? And I just don't know the answer to that one.
And while I can't answer that, the other sub-question was about hydrogen, and I just want to say that in California, our former governor, Schwarzenegger, had made all of LAX, he happens to own the whole hydrogen stations starting at San Pedro, and all of, you cannot have a bus or a car vehicle going to Marriott or anything that's not hydrogen driven. And it's interesting that the company I am a major owner of, NPC, Natural Power Concepts, with deep ocean technology, when the ocean pulsates 9 to 12 feet a minute 2 miles offshore, we have one of the top hydrogen guys, Captain, I had his name a second ago in my head. Anyhow, he's the top hydrogen guy in the Navy, and he's figured out how to use simple electrolysis and break oxygen and hydrogen so we can have hydrogen vehicles. And what I said earlier is that we're going to need all of the above, because we're going to have deep energy crunches. Where I live in California, all the politicos are saying we're going to have the hottest day ever based on all meteorological reports in August 15th, and there's no way we're going to have 44 million megavolt of power, megawatts of power, sorry. And they said, we've got to do something. Well, as smart as we are sitting here, we don't think that can be created that fast, do we? Nope, he's shaking his head no, just so those of you who aren't watching, Michael, I don't think it could either, but we're in this exciting time, like Rick was talking about, how fast the plants are showing up and how great the people are and the breakthroughs. And it's an exciting time. We're in the equivalent, I say, of the Rockefeller oil rush starting in 1906, and we're in about 1908, 2 years into it, and we're saying, holy cow, Henry Ford just sold 14 million cars, and here comes a little company called GM. Well, now we're saying Tesla started it, but there's a lot of people out there saying we're going to bite at his heels.
Great. Rick?
Okay, the next question came from Michael, and this is, I promise, not a planted question. It's perfect, though. What are the trends in governmental support for solar at either the federal, state, or local levels? Being from North Carolina, I'm reading a lot about pushback that I fear will retard the momentum that's previously gathered in their state. So, Michael, you have some experience in North Carolina?
I didn't pose that question because I'm in Texas. So, you know, the good news is that in a few years, solar won't need subsidies. And, you know, I'm a pretty big market guy, and so my preference would always be an even playing field. You know, if you could either take all of the subsidies away from all of the proposed energy technologies so that, you know, the best player wins, I think that would be great. But I also recognize that 10 years ago, there's no way solar could have competed. There was no way it could get to where it was today without the assistance it's gotten, not just from the U.S. government, but from the, you know, other governments around the world. And, you know, if you want to understand why solar gets cheaper every year, I think you have to think about 15 or maybe 10 years ago. One of our associates who runs the Principal Solar Institute is a guy named Matt Thompson, who's a PhD, and Matt was involved in Moore's Law forever. And, you know, we would always call him and say, okay, what's happening? Are we going to make it this year? And but that technology, that silicon was to produce chips about the size of your fingernail. And then all of a sudden the Spaniards called and said, I need a square mile. Think about the silicon manufacturers when that happened. The world had to change. They had to figure new ways of boiling that silicon and purifying it and making cells. And that's what's happened. But that wouldn't have happened if the Spanish government hadn't said, let's create this industry. And so, you know, you have to have mixed feelings about it. The government did help make it come to where it is today.
Yeah, and I'm going to add to that about the mixed feelings is that I think the public is saying, hey, look, we want our refrigerator to keep going. We love our electric dishwasher. we want the house heated in the winter and air conditioned in the summer, and they're saying, hey, look, where I live in California, we've just shut down our nuclear power plant, which is still leaking, San Onofre, and they're saying, hey, wait a second, this is the same garbage that happened in Japan, and it's not okay with us. It's polluting the ocean still. And we've had some problems of shortage of energy. We've had rolling brownouts, and they're suggesting when you have giant blackouts, and everyone's going to say, hey, wait a second. I want to get off the grid or create a new grid, which is the prevailing conversation that I'm hearing even politicians and mayors saying, hey, let's make this place energy independent. Michael and I have talked to one of the major mayors in California who is a leading edge gentle person, and he said, I want to be the solar capital of the planet, and we're saying, okay, we're raising our hand and we'll work with you. And what he said is that we're going to go from legislation that takes 3 weeks to get approval down to 15 minutes. You guys come and bring it to me. I'll personally get it stamped in 15 minutes or heads will roll. So we're in a brand new game as far as I'm concerned, even politically and legislatively and mayorally and gubernatorially. How's that? There's a big word I can almost pronounce. Take it away, Rick.
Okay, and one other comment about our North Carolina audience member. You should be very proud about your state. You guys have used market forces and some subsidies. You've extended your state subsidies for another year to keep that momentum going. And your major utility, Duke Power, has become very supportive of grid-scale solar, more so than most utilities outside of California. Yeah. Within a year or two, North Carolina should be the #2 state in the country for solar, only behind California. So for a state that is around #10 in population, that's a pretty impressive feat. Okay, the next question we had was, if grid solar replaces coal, nuclear, and natural gas, where do we get power at night or on cloudy days? And I will amend to that, how much solar could we put onto the grid?
Well, this is Michael again. I think I'm much more grounded in the electric utility industry, and so I'm not a believer that solar is a 24-hour-a-day technology. However, there are a lot of people right now who follow the same trend line we talked about with batteries and say, we will be able to charge batteries during the day and use that to power our grid at night. I grew up as a young engineer helping to build a nuclear power plant, so I have a slightly different perspective on it. I see the value that nuclear has brought to our country and to the world, and I agree with Mark Victor Hansen that we've had problems with it, but all in all, it's been a pretty reliable source of power. And coal, as dirty as it is, has gotten us to where we are right now. But those two things we'll see phasing out. I think we'll see natural gas power plants for the next 100 years. We've got a lot of natural gas. It's relatively clean. And, you know, today solar is extending the longevity of natural gas. It's shaving off the very high demand for electricity during the daytime. So most people don't realize electricity usage looks like a bell curve. It's kind of flat at night, and then the sun rises and the demand for electricity rises. And the interesting thing is, you know, you have to turn on new power plants during the daytime to take care of that demand for electricity. So that's when the sun rises. That's when solar can come in and do its job.
The only other thing I'd add, because the question was about the grid, is we're talking about two different grid ideas here. One is the American grid, which is a great grid. I'm not besmirching anything. We got the best utility engineers on the planet. But when I was in grad school, Bucky said, look, let's do a global grid that literally circles around the top of the planet and also uses the solar when we're out sunny here and it's nighttime in China, and then ship it over, you know, back through Hawaii, back through, go east, and literally ship the energy around the world as it's needed and utilize all of solar, geothermal, tidal, the income energies in addition to nuke, in addition to coal. And the other thing is that we've got some real cleanups happening in coal and getting all that working. I mean, I can tell you, I've talked to the people at Peabody recently, and they're getting me convinced that maybe there is a way to take that energy, use it, and take all the coal goop and turn back all the gold and all the other stuff that's sitting in it. I mean, this is breakthrough stuff, and it's all happening because people are waking up and saying, hey, look, we've got to clean up this environment. We have one little spaceship, which my teacher, Bucky Fuller, named in 1943. We live in a little spaceship. We're all astronauts on the planet. We all have to learn to live together by living together because we either have livingry or weaponry. And he wrote a book while I was on his staff for 7 years called Utopia or Oblivion, and he said we would hit it right now exactly that we can go to utopia if we just up the energy and do it sufficiently for all the people on the planet, because once you got the energy, then you can have the desalinated and other cleaning vehicles of water. And Michael and I have been asked even to clean up some of the water and rivers as close to us as Mexico, which we're right next to here. And once you got the energy, you got the water, you got the water, you got the food, you got the food, you create what Christ talked about in John 10:10, fundamental abundance, you know, and we can have for the first time literally fundamental abundance for 7 billion people. That has never existed before, even as a real potential. It was a great idea, a beautiful concept, but now with adequate energy and especially with a sun that won't run out for 5 billion years, we got a pretty good deal. Rick?
Okay, the next question that came in was, what is your vision for how EVs will be used in vehicle-to-grid application? And the questioner can clarify, but I think that means where you plug your car into the garage, and if you're not needing your car, then the car could pass power back into your house and be used in the grid.
Yeah, so let's think about that battery in your electric vehicle and go back to some of the fundamentals that Mark Victor talked about. One of the fundamentals was you get in your car, you drive 5 hours, you've consumed a full tank of gas. That same 1 gallon of gas might run a house for a day, or that same tank of gas might run your house for a week. So now the storm blows in, knocks out the electricity in your neighborhood, plug your Tesla into your home electric circuit, and your stuff in your freezer doesn't rot, and your air conditioning still runs, and you can watch your TV and work your computer. So I think the interesting thing that we've only just begun to think about is how the car might interact with the home. Normally you pull into your driveway, plug it in, and charge it at night, but if the electricity goes out, why not? Why can't that car battery run your home? And I think the answer is it will.
I agree with everything Michael just said, and I want to just add that if you haven't seen the new video that Elon Musk made on a Tesla wall, you know, you might want to look at it. It's a little bit bigger than he originally predicted. Originally he predicted it's going to be about the size of 3 together flashlights. So it's bigger than that, but the fact is, this is what we're going to be charging up with the excess solar panel on your house, or on the wall next to your house, or in your backyard, or in the field or something. And we've got, Michael and I have been talking about some other cool ideas that we can't share with you yet, but the batteries are going to break through, and a lot of people are going to say, hey, wait a second, even if I live in a city, maybe I can go off the grid so there's never going to be any downtime for me, my computer, my refrigerator, my air conditioning and heating. We're in an amazing time that a lot of people are going to get independent, and the goal for every American, and I know we've got people listening literally from around the world, but I'll just talk about this as a patriotic American, the goal is to have freedom. And one of the things that Michael and I have talked about in my offices at great length is let's get energy freedom for everybody for the first time in human history. Rick?
Great. The next question, we probably have time for just one more, so chat in your last questions. But the next question was, do you see a carbon tax in our future, and will this wreak havoc on the power industry?
I sure hope not. Why? Please don't do it. That's all I can say.
By the way, Michael and I are both staunch, the less taxes, the better. And I got to tell you, I was just on a program with a guy I love and read all the time, Steve Forbes. I loved his dad and his grandfather. But Steve Forbes says, death tax is taxation without respiration. And basically what he's saying is any tax is a death tax because politicians started tax. I'll just give the best example. I lived in New York for 7 years. And they said, well, we will put this toll on this bridge and we'll pay for it in 7 years and we'll never charge you again. Well, if you've been to New York, not only did that bridge get charged, but every other bridge that had already been built got charged taxes, and you pay to go in and out of it, and it's amazing. So we don't want any more taxes, and we don't want a carbon tax. We are already getting taxed. Our health is taxed by carbon tax. Where I work in China all the time, kids are dying at 10 years old because they sold 300 million cars there last year. There's simply too much pollution in the air. They've given up their bicycles. They've given up walking. And I love the Chinese. I'm not knocking them. They just come in the last 8 years into free enterprise understanding and getting out of communism, which I'm very keen on. But we've got to get rid of all kinds of taxes, inclusive of carbon in the atmosphere. And the best way to do that is income-generated energy that we're talking about here on this show.
And I'll add a comment to that. I agree that I don't see a carbon tax in the future in the U.S. However, there are financial companies like Goldman Sachs who have started to include a cost of carbon in their business case analysis. And their position is that although there might not be a carbon tax, there will be a cost of carbon through multinational companies that work in places like Europe where there are carbon markets. And then also just businesses that are trying to have a sustainable operation, purchasing renewable energy credits and things like that that have a long-term benefit but short-term cost. So even though we don't have a carbon tax in our political future, we are seeing large companies volunteer to add those costs into their considerations. Okay, we have time for one last question. The Texas state government seems focused on natural gas in its alternative vehicle initiatives. Are there any ideas how we can convince them to try and incorporate electric or fuel cell vehicles into their alternative vehicle promotion plans? And I'll add that you better hurry because the legislature ends in about a month or two for the next 2 years.
I think the best way to do it is for Elon Musk to give a free Tesla away to the governor. All he has to do is drive it, and then he'll be an advocate. I can't even tell you. I hope everybody on this call has been around an electric vehicle. One of my favorite electric vehicle stories is the first guy who I knew that owned a Tesla. We opened up the trunk, and the trunk is huge because there's no gas tank underneath, right? And then I thought, wait a minute, what's in the front if the motor is sitting on the wheel? So we open up the front, and it's a trunk, So, and you get in this thing, and there's no smell. It's just the leather or whatever. You don't know that there's that hydrocarbon smell in every car until you get in one that doesn't have it. So I think it will happen. Even us slow Texans will come around eventually. Hey, Rick, one more thing. The white paper that Mark Victor Hansen and I co-authored is available on the net. There's no advertising. It's completely free of charge. Hopefully everybody knows that they can download it and read it and use the graphics and cite it and whatever else.
And give it to 10 of your friends, because we really want people to start thinking that there's an EV in their future.
Great, thank you very much for reminding me. I just chatted out the link to all participants. If they want to download it, it is free. You just simply need to register with the same email that you used to register for this webinar. That's all the time that we have today. Do either of you have any parting conclusions, Michael or Mark?
Just that I believe every one of you is going to be in an EV vehicle within the next decade. Michael and I are predicting it. We don't know anyone else who's we think that's not only going to happen in America, but it's going to happen in the world. And the sooner the better, because I really want to save our little biosphere, atmosphere, ocean that we all need to live in and thrive in and have our grandkids and kids live in.
That's it. Thanks, Rick.
All right. Great. Well, thank you all for attending. Thanks again to today's sponsors, Principal Solar, the Energy Storage Association, Viridian, and Solar Wake Up.